And now let me introduce the guests of our first panel entitled Protecting Values in Global Politics. So let us please welcome Mayor Andy Burnham, who's with us online. You can all see him on this big screen. Thank you so much, Mayor Burnham. We really value that you are able to join us, and thanks to Neil McInroy for getting us in touch. Mayor Burnham is the mayor of Greater Manchester City region, and I hope he will tell us a bit more as another example of a politician who's able to bring together values and effective policies. And let me now also invite the speakers who are with us live. As you can see, we've got a relatively small crowd, also for COVID safety reasons, as you can see around, but we don't have many people, but I'm really sure we have the right people here. So let me please welcome Nicolas Tenzer. Nicolas, please. Nicolas is the editor of Le Banquet, founding president of Serap. Excuse my French, I don't speak French. Needs to learn more. Guest professors at Sciences Po, and a political commentator, a very outspoken one in France. Let me also welcome Mr. Jacek Rostowski, a former Minister of Finance of Poland and also Deputy Prime Minister that time, economist. Let me welcome Ms. Anna Radwan, member of Szymon Hołownia's Poland's 2050 party, also founder of In Europa think tank. And my name is Mateusz Piotrowski, I'm the president of Europe A Patient. Let us start. Policy and values, the name might sound a bit like business ethics. So something like CSR or even PR. Yet, I think our discussions yesterday on the pandemics, on the Russian aggression on Ukraine, on climate breakdown to a certain extent, showed that disregarding values comes with a real cost, with an ethical debt that decision makers and their nations have to pay with interest. So I'm really happy we'll have to discuss these matters with our distinguished guests and to talk more and think more together on this kind of ethics of responsibility we would like to see. So let me start with Mayor Burnham. So my question would be how to put values in practice in governing a major city region. And perhaps, Mayor Burnham, you could speak especially on the community well-building projects, cooperative projects, which we are also very much interested to put into practice in the Polish core regions as Europa Patient, and also on how this translates to social cohesion and building a more resilient polity and city. So, Mayor Burnham, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. I was in Poland earlier this week and sadly couldn't stay on for this conference, but I will come back at the end to explain why I was there. And hopefully the reason offers something of an answer to the question as to how we protect values and secure progress in a very difficult global climate. But for those who don't know, I'll start with a very quick introduction. I was for 16 years a member of the British Parliament. I was a cabinet minister in Gordon Brown's Labour government and a minister in the Blair government, but left Westminster in 2017 because I guess I fell out of love with it. I just didn't see how it could make the kind of change that I wanted to see. And ever since leaving, I feel that my conclusion in 2017 has only become more true. Of course, not just in the UK, we've seen the polarization of politics and the rise of right-wing populism right around the world. And the consequence of that has been, it's been kind of harder to secure social progress at the level of national government when you have more polarized, dysfunctional politics at that level. That's been particularly true of the UK, where we're really now at the end of a decade of real turbulence, a decade that started with the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, then the Brexit referendum, then the COVID pandemic, now the cost of living crisis, a huge turbulence, a failure to address social issues. So we've got rising poverty and inequality. And what all of this has done, in my view, is expose the inadequacies of the highly centralized, antiquated British state. So that takes me to where I am now, and hopefully to offer an answer to your question. You know, what do we do about this? The positive thing about where we are in Britain right now is that a number of politicians on left and right have recognized how things need to change, and we need a new political settlement in the UK. And one of the glimmers of hope has been the emergence in England of a more devolved approach at the city region level. And the city region that I lead, Greater Manchester, has been very much at the forefront of this movement, pioneering a new way of making social change from the bottom up, an approach that isn't a traditional public sector or government approach to making change, but instead unites all sectors, public sector, private sector, charitable sector, community sector, faith sector, in building social movements focused on social missions. And that's very much what we're trying to do in Greater Manchester, unlocking the power of society from the bottom up. So to give you an example, a first example on homelessness, when I came in as mayor, I launched the Greater Manchester Homelessness Action Network. Rather than making organisations compete for funding, as so often we have done in the past, we united everybody in a powerful network and unlocked the contribution of everybody across those different sectors that I mentioned. And as a result, rough sleeping in England, which has been rising everywhere else, has not been rising in Greater Manchester. And we've made a real difference and have a different way of supporting people every night through the funds that we are able to raise. If I could give you a second example of how we've changed things and sought to build wealth in our communities, as you've described, it's a different approach to the whole question of social security and benefits. At a national level, there is always a punitive rhetoric about the social security system, the sense that people are exploiting it or seeking to take funds from it on a fraudulent basis. Instead, we've taken a much more supportive approach, working with local organisations to get people back to work. And actually, we have helped more people back to work, setting people up to succeed rather than fail as often as done nationally. A third example, and perhaps this is the most powerful example, we have sought to improve employment standards from the bottom up. The pandemic in Britain revealed how millions of people here have an employment status that damages their health. They are in such insecure employment that they were unable to go home when they were ill during the pandemic because they had no access to sick pay or wouldn't be paid because they were on such insecure employment contracts. We are bringing forward an answer to this in the form of the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter, which sets out what good work looks like: decent pay, job security, flexibility, and all the other things that we would associate with good work. And what we are doing is linking that charter to all public procurement in our city region. I heard the previous speaker hark back to Margaret Thatcher, and he was right to do so, because we would recognise that as the start of things going wrong, and a move towards the mantra that the market is the answer to everything. Well, I can tell you that the message here from Britain, or certainly from Greater Manchester, is that it certainly is most not. And actually, if you follow that deregulated approach, you will find that it actually creates a huge number of social challenges. We saw that with bus services, where she deregulated bus services and caused chaos and a failing service. So we are the first city region to put buses back under public control in England. And as a result of that process, the contracting, we linked it to our good employment charter. So now the staff working on our bus system are beginning to experience better terms and conditions. The point is, you can make social change that actually achieves a number of objectives: better public transport for our residents, and of course, better terms and conditions for the staff providing that service. Lower fares and higher wages. Lower fares for passengers, higher wages for the staff delivering the service. So I would conclude, if I may, to say, well, what does this tell us about where we go from here, both in Britain and around the world? How do we protect values in a very challenging global political climate? I would say that the answer actually does lie in cities. Cities are where the progressive thinking is to be found. Cities are the places where people do more than walk on by on the other side. They see the importance of everybody succeeding together. So the first answer to the question is giving more power to cities, and then using that power to network all of the different players within those places around missions, social missions that matter, and economic missions too. But the second part of the answer is then not just to network cities themselves, but to network one place, one city with another around the world, and create powerful networks of progressive cities that can actually challenge the narrative around this drift towards right-wing populism, this divisive rhetoric that we are all struggling with in all of our cities. Cities do not want to see the communities of our city regions divided one from another. We do want to create that solidarity amongst all of our communities. And as I meet mayors around the world, and I was recently at an event in Washington with US mayors, what you notice is cities everywhere, North America, Latin America, Europe, everywhere, we're all facing the same issues. We're all facing the challenge of homelessness. We're all facing the challenge of changing public transport. We're all facing the same things. And we tend to take a more pragmatic approach rather than the political rhetoric approach, which always comes through national politics. And if you network cities more and more, I think they can create an alternative, a counter narrative to what we hear coming out of national politics and politicians. And the reason to finish why I was in Poland this week was I was doing exactly what I've just said to you. Earlier this year, the mayor of Lviv came to the northwest of England because we were hosting the Eurovision Song Contest on behalf of Ukraine. It was being held in Liverpool. But the mayor from Lviv asked us, if myself and the mayor of Liverpool City Region, if we would help with his Unbroken project, a project to make his city the rehabilitation center for Ukraine after the conflict, a place where people will be able to get the mental health support and the physical health support, a huge job that they've got ahead of them as they seek to repair the damage. I traveled to Krakow this week to meet him again and say that I am, together with my colleague in Liverpool, Steve Rotherham, we're going to launch the Unbroken Cities Network, where we ask cities that have been through terrorism and trauma, like we have here in Manchester, to come together to open up our networks in our cities, our medical networks, our charitable networks, our business networks, to give him the funds and the expertise that he will need to make Lviv that rehabilitation center. And the point is, sometimes it might be you're working with centre-right cities, but that's a good thing, I would say. You know, getting different political cities working together to counteract the polarization of politics that we're seeing being driven by divisive populist politics at the national level. So the Unbroken Cities Network, I would suggest that is an example of how we protect values in a difficult and dangerous global climate, networking cities to work together around Europe and around the world, bringing people back together after the divisions of Brexit. That's how it seems from here in Greater Manchester. And with that, I will hand back to you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Mayor Burnham, for this pragmatic and practical examples of how to embody values in policies. And we'll be very happy to share it with local governments we work with in Poland and maybe meet you with them at some point. Let me now move to Prime Minister Rostowski and a very short question, building on what has been said. If you could share with us your views on the relation between policy and values in the times of a rivalry between democracies, autocracies, and let's call it populist rebellions.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad we talked before the conference, because you asked the question that I prepared myself to answer, but I didn't remember what it was. And I was inspired by Monsieur Lambert to say a few things, which actually happen to fit in rather well to this. So what I initially wanted to talk about was that the theme of the session is putting values back into politics. And what I want to talk about is putting the politics back into values. Because in fact, unless you can be successful politically, your values in the end don't matter. And as Monsieur Lambert said, values are not a decorative element. And they are just a decorative element unless you're successful politically. Now, there's almost nothing else that Monsieur Lambert said that I agreed with, and I shall go through the list in a moment. But I think a good starting point might be Winston Churchill, who famously said, democracy is a very bad system of government, but all the others are so much worse. And it's my belief that the fundamental line along which politics are being fought is the one along which Vladimir Putin, Erdogan, Orban, Kaczynski, Donald Trump are on one side, and Monsieur Lambert, Margaret Thatcher, Liz Cheney, Bill Barr, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and myself, and Monsieur Lambert are on the other side. And I think he's drawing the line in absolutely the wrong place. We are in an absolutely existential struggle for democracy at the moment. And the reason it's existential is basically because the rot, for the first time, has in a politically significant way infected the United States of America. All right? The symptom of this is Donald Trump. It's not that the United States were always wonderfully democratic. After all, a country of mass slavery, a country of mass racial discrimination, but nevertheless never on that side of the line. The Confederacy was, but the North wasn't. And the United States as a whole never were. And now this is in play. Now what happens when the autocrats, the populist autocrats, come to power, we know by just having a look at what's happening a couple of 100 kilometers from here, in the bloodiest war that we've had in Europe since the Second World War, and the bloodiest war that's happening at the moment, in fact, in the world. Now, I'd just like to say one other thing that I do agree with Monsieur Lambert on, and that is the extremely bad way that we're treating refugees in Europe who want to come to Europe. It's not the only reason that's not the only reason that we've lost our moral, or some of our moral authority. Another reason is, for instance, that we kept most of the vaccines for ourselves until we handed them out to the South. But this is where we actually see the real awful dilemmas of maintaining democracy. If we were as open as we should be according to international law, let's not kid ourselves, not a single European or North American democracy would survive. Now that doesn't mean we can't do better than we're doing, but we cannot, unfortunately, do as well as we should. And having a democracy, even though we could have handed over a fair share of the vaccines from the beginning to the South, there are practically no democracies that would have done it of their free will. Well, we could have done it without losing democracy, but you couldn't have it would have been enormously difficult. So I think we just need to realize these facts and face them and think about how we're going to deal with it. Now, just very briefly on Margaret Thatcher, I'm an not entirely unrepentant neoliberal. So slightly repentant, but only slightly. I would point out that, of course, saying that utility functions mean that something that has price has no price, has no value is, I apologize, absurd. It's absurd in the case, it's absurd. I mean, no economist would believe that. And no economist in the world does, would, or ever did. I'm sorry. But we can also look at the practicalities. Margaret Thatcher was one of the motors of the treaty banning CFCs. She knew that there were global threats, right? She also, if she didn't believe in values, she wouldn't have prosecuted the Falklands War, because there was no money in regaining the Falklands, right? So I'd also say another thing. If it weren't for Thatcher and Reagan, we would not have recovered our freedom and democracy in this part of the world. Also, when we built the markets here, and here I have to tip a hat to my former boss, who often gets into fights with me because he's much more neoliberal than I am, Leszek Balcerowicz. But when we were introducing market economies here, we were very neoliberal in our mental state because we believed in that freedom, individual freedom that goes with free markets. But we knew extremely well that we had to build institutions. And we never dreamt for a moment that we could do it without democracy. Margaret Thatcher just assumed there would be democracy, right? Now, you can argue that what she believed in has led to things that now undermine it. Yes, but don't say that she didn't know that there were other things that were valuable. Well, that's what you implied. And so that's simply wrong. But nevertheless, I think we have to, if we draw the line where I think it goes, you and I can argue about these things. But we have to know where the fundamental line is. It doesn't mean there aren't other lines. And it's thanks to that approach that we've been able to defeat authoritarian populism in Poland, and I'm sure that the next speaker will be able to tell us a bit. It's a new party that came into creation, into existence, as a well, I'll leave it to her to say as what, and what implications she draws. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. So let me move to Ms. Radon without further delay and ask a question, switching gears a bit. We got used to, in the public discourse, of the thought that the populist threat, however we understand it, happened mostly here, in Central Eastern Europe. So what we need to do then is to catch up with, the political culture of stable democracies of the European core. But this is not the case for quite some time. And we can see, just take example of Germany, that it might be the case that we will have at least 25% of the vote going to parties which are not only much friendlier, to say the least, towards Vladimir Putin, but also much more skeptical of the EU climate agenda. I mean, Sarah Wagenknecht and AfD. So my question would be, with representing the new coming party, how do you see this dynamic and how do you see this changing map that you can no longer think that we're just catching up with Western Europe?
Thank you so much. Yes, actually, I'm not very, I'm new in politics. Let me introduce you myself. I was working in NGO sector for many years. I was working for Schuman Foundation, and we are dealing with European affairs for many years. In politics, I'm quite new person. I was running in recent elections. With a success and not success, I got 15,000 votes, which is a lot, but didn't manage to get to the parliament. But because it was my first election, I see it, I perceive it as a success. So every time when there's, how you as a politician, think about this or that, then I think, okay, it's not time to be NGOs and to have visions without concrete. Sorry to say that. I was in NGOs and we were telling people, politicians, what should they do. Now, today, when I'm a politician, I know it's more difficult to give the concrete answers and concrete policies. But back to your question and refer also what was Mr. Lambert saying at the beginning of our meeting. I think the main topic and the main issue is the trust. And I think this is crucial in our discussion about the climate policy, about the Ukraine, about international affairs, about the conflict in Gaza and Israel. The trust is on the top, and this is the most important thing I think we should work on as a value. And this is not my idea. This is also the OECD who made some researches that if we want to make the change, the trust is one of the crucial things. And of course, the one who are building the trust, who are responsible for the trust, are politicians, but also the media. And about the climate change, which you mentioned, we had many situations, many very bad examples about politicians like Trump, Bolsonaro, Kaczynski, and the politicians in Poland who are not building the trust in science, not building the trust to real good work of the scientific researchers, and it didn't build the trust to for the future debate on the climate crisis. And another thing is the media, which also plays a very, very important role in building trust. I was surprised often to read, and maybe all of you, in Financial Times, in Washington Post, is publishing the articles on anti-climate journalists, which was really surprised. And I think this is the example of how we should pay more attention on responsibility on media. So back to your question, the trust is something we should work on. And about your question about the climate change, I think yesterday when there was the poll in Poland made before for the new government, there was a question, what should be the first thing the government should tackle? And I wonder, how do you think, where was the climate? There were no climate. There were no even a question on climate in this poll. So this shows us how difficult it will be to tackle it in the future.
Thank you so much. Without further ado, let me now move to Nicholas Tenzer, who's an expert on international relations diplomacy. And my question would be, what kind of ethics of responsibility do we need when it comes to the decisions, or to quote you, non-decisions that European political leaders are now taking?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Well, I will start basically by just reflecting on the question of values. For me, it's not an abstract thing. I mean, basically, most of the values are enshrined, in international laws. And I think that the first thing that we have to look at if the states are basically abiding by international law or not. And I think that the true issue is this one, because I do think that most of the Western leaders basically didn't pay enough attention to international law. I mean, they consider something like optional, not something that they have to comply with. And that could explain a lot of basically mistakes and blunders and even sins that they were committed since, probably more than 23 or 24 years, at least since Putin came to power. I said that international law is something which is not, and values by themselves are not about some things that we have to proclaim, but that's all about actions. That's not about, statements. That's about enforcement. And I think we have, certainly when we are talking about values, make a hierarchy not between the values themselves, but basically there is a hierarchy between the things that matter at first and the things that basically matter less. And the true thing right now is that we are at war. And when we are talking, the war that Putin, is waging on Ukraine, and all the wars that he was waging since the 24 years, starting with Chechnya and Georgia and Syria, in fact, of course, all the crackdown on human rights, also, in Belarus with the dictators that he is supporting, Lukashenko, considering the fact that he was basically still, just occupying, 20% of Georgian territories, not talking about Transnistria, etc., and all the coups that he was supporting in Africa, and all the regimes that he is also supporting in Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, the junta in Myanmar, etc. I think that we certainly have to consider what we missed. And in fact, what we missed is basically the questions of the enforcement of international law. And by enforcement of international law, enforcement of values is about our own willingness to wage a war. It's about war, because basically the values is not only about climate change, solidarity between people. Yes, it is. But at first, is about life and death. And I was very, very afraid and by the fact that many Western leaders in quite all the EU countries were still considering, maybe they are still considering that they can talk with Putin, that they could shake hands with Mr. Putin. I just recall Philippe Lambert's before, that I was one of the rare in France who was calling for the boycott of the World War Cup in 2018. And something that even, I said to my president, how can you shake hands with Mr. Putin when already in Syria he killed more Syrian civilians than even ISIS did? When he massacred so many Chechens, in 1999 and 2000. And in 2018, you had already the war in Ukraine that actually killed 14,000. And I think it's just not possible to consider this kind of behavior. It's not about realism. Because also, if we consider all the murders that Putin enforced in Russia, and the crackdown of human rights, civil liberties, I think it was very good prediction for aggression abroad. But we turned a blind eye to that, because we turned a blind eye to the questions of international law. If it matters, basically, it creates some duties for the allies. And we cannot talk about, let's say, as long as it takes. We have to act right now, because it's about basically saving Ukrainian lives. And the more the war lasts, the more Ukrainian lives will be lost. Syrian lives as well. And so the questions of values is about the risk. And we have to take the risk to confront Russia. Maybe it could be, of course, China one day, because also the questions of the human rights and the question of basic freedoms in Taiwan matter more than all. And of course, we can talk about other issues, as I mentioned, which are perfectly legitimate, climate change, social issues, etc. But if we are not defeating Russia in Ukraine and elsewhere, all the other issues will become meaningless. Because right now we are in a kind of turning point of history. Either we succeed in defeating Putin, or the destiny we will face will be the kind of destiny that we would have had if Hitler was not defeated in 1945. We are in a situation like the situation that we were witnessing during World War II. I mean, that's basically the fight between good and evil. And we cannot remain halfway. We cannot stay in the middle saying, okay, we could find a kind of compromise, we can wait until, okay. Basically, and I will finish with that, the very fact is that we were not, in Europe and in the US, willing to save Ukrainian lives. We could have done that. We could have saved thousands of Ukrainian lives. We didn't want to. And so we can talk about abstract values. If we are not able and willing to do that, what's the very meaning of our values? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We're already over time, so just one question from the floor.
Yes, thank you very much to all the speakers. I really loved hearing all of your remarks, but I just wanted to point out something about the recent Polish economic history, because not everyone might be aware of what happened during the Donald Tusk government, which is, I would say, the beginning of the end of, very doctrinaire economic policy, namely the Keynesian turn that Finance Minister Rostowski has been co-author of, meaning we have increased the debt in order to protect investments, in order to protect growth, jobs, absorbing the EU funds. And as we have seen with the results have been, we have had the best growth in the whole of the European Union during the 2009. And very good results overall. I also wanted to praise you as a co-author, the guy who stopped basically the money grab of the privatized insurance system offer that gave 7% premium on top of everything that that the Polish people tried to save for retirement. So I think, you know, there had been some watershed moments, and maybe we stick to the label of neoliberalism, but we need to look a little bit further and see that actually, when we start to abandon those ideas, we can also have very great, pragmatically driven results. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll let
very briefly,
yes, absolutely.
Very briefly, because it's actually quite interesting. So first of all, yes, I mean, Margaret Thatcher also increased the national debt when she was bringing inflation down, and had a big loss big fall in government revenue, and that kind of Keynesianism is just pragmatic, you know. And of course, there are people who don't want to do it, but that's just foolish. Neoliberalism or liberalism doesn't require stupidity or a lack of pragmatism. Secondly, but the more interesting case is the one on the privatized pension funds, because that shows how important pragmatism is for any sensible policy. 1990, even before 1990, I was at the Institute of Economic Affairs, which was then a Thatcherite think tank, and they introduced me to somebody who'd introduced these private well, they're not really private. You take government money and you give it to private funds, right, on individual accounts for them to invest them on the stock exchange. And somebody who'd done this in Chile, and he was explaining to me how we really had to do this in Poland at a time when we practically had no private sector larger than small shops and a few sort of, workshops. And I thought at the time it was completely mad. It was then introduced, and it was introduced in a way that had to be bad. I won't go into the details. So, of course, I said I'm a slightly repentant neoliberal. I mean, not repentant for something I did, but for maybe something that somebody else did. It is possible to take any ideology too far. That's true. And I think, we all need to watch out for that. We all have a duty to our citizens and our voters to be pragmatic and commonsensical, as well as being idealistic and defending values.
Which I think serves a very good final thought for the panel. I'm really honored. Yes.
Once again, thank you very much for the voice about the Ukraine, but because in Poland, this is obvious, sorry to say what you said, but then I thought about this perspective, French perspective. So that's why please spread this message, not only in Europe, but in Paris, in Berlin. I think the politicians are aware, but thank you so much for this message.
If I may, I mean, basically, just a few words. I think still we are, in my view, sleepwalkers walking on a tightrope. But in fact, I mean, in the world. But I mean, the decisive power right now in the US. And what I am the most afraid of is basically the US right now. And not only with Trump, of course, Trump will be a catastrophe, I mean, of major amplitude and magnitude and everything. But even with Biden, I mean, staying in power, and I know many of his advisors and people around him, I know there is still, I mean, the temptations to negotiate, to break a deal, etc. I mean, people talking about negotiations, I mean, they're just insane. Under the disgrace, we cannot envision this kind of negotiation, peace talks, etc. And I mean, that's the point.
Thank you so much. We'll need to stop now. There will be time for discussion during the lunch and so on. Thank you again, and big round of applause to our speakers. Thank you so much.